So the significance of this event is it's on the question of how the Labour Party can maintain the support of Leave voters. And it's particularly significant in today's climate because the Labour Eurosceptic narrative has essentially been lost due to the intense barrage of Tory Brexit messaging. Will there be a Boris Brexit coup? Will Theresa May last another week? But this cannot be allowed to continue for two main reasons. The roots of the Labour Party lie within working class communities up and down the country, whose historical identities are based around industries such as fishing, mining, and it's many of these people who voted to leave in the 2016 referendum. And they did so with the expectation that their vote would not only be respected by their country, but by the party who they consider to represent them. And on a more pragmatic basis, Labour Brexiteers matter electorally. If the Labour Party wishes to be in power within the next decade, they must begin to recognise that over 3 in 10 of their voters voted to leave, and more significantly, that 70% of Labour constituencies did so as well. So on that note, we're going to start with our first speaker, Gisela Stuart, who is the former Member of Parliament for Birmingham Edgbaston from 1997 to 2017. She was the chair of Vote Leave campaign during the referendum, currently the chair of Change Britain, and was central to the creation of Article 50 and its inclusion in the Lisbon Treaty, which we have a lot to thank her for. So welcome, Gisela.
Well, thank you very much. And I actually went the other day through my papers from the Constitutional Convention in 2002-2003, and I came across the notes where we talked about whether there should be a clause to leave. And I remember I found this sort of rather aggressive little note from the Foreign Office which says, this is not a Foreign Office priority. And I argued, but I thought it was a priority for Parliament. And what was interesting is what swayed them to include a clause which allowed to leave was actually Giuliano Amato, the Italian vice president who was a former prime minister of Italy and a very, very good constitutional lawyer. And he essentially said, to leave at the moment would be left to treaty basis, which is unclear, and if you want to have clear rules, you must define them. And therefore he agreed that we had to have a clause. And then they created Article 50, which later on, which wasn't meant to be clear. However, I think we need to sort of just a few quick reflections. One is, if you'd said to me on the 23rd of June in 2016 that in the 1st of November 2018 I'd be sitting in here discussing how we're going to leave, I would have said to you, you are stark raving mad, you know? But we are here, and it tells us something, and it tells us something that when you want to bring about change, which goes against the will of actually fairly small, but nevertheless very vociferous establishment, then that is really painful and it is hard work. And you know, we mustn't give up on this. And one of the things which I prepared for coming here, or just look back on, is that after the referendum, we made a big strategic error, which was we thought owed to the government that they would implement it. So we kind of went back to our party political roots, whereas the Remain campaign continued to work as a Remain. And the government wasn't rebutting stuff. So we as Change Britain went out and did a lot of polling and focus groups. And I just went back to this stuff because in polling what matters are trends. And the thing, there's a bit of churning, but I tell you what's out there is nobody out there has changed their minds. This notion of the, what was it saying, 100 and odd leave, well, I want to know where they are. The March for a Second referendum, how many there were there who said, I voted leave and now I've changed my mind? I can't find any of them. So it is essentially a regrouping of those who are refusing to accept the outcome. And the reason why this is so dangerous for Labour in particular, I mean, refusing to accept the outcome actually is just as dangerous for the Tories, but I care slightly more about the future of the Labour Party than about the Tory Party. They can sort themselves out, is the example of Scotland. It is perfectly possible for a party that is deeply entrenched to be wiped out. And what we saw in Scotland with the rise of the SNP, I don't know about you, Kate, I mean, when we came in, Scotland was so dominated by Labour that the thinking came out of Scotland, and suddenly You know, we come back after general election and there's one Labour MP left in Scotland and there are these 56 SNP MPs there. And a lot of theirs actually wasn't yes, the Scottish nationalism had something to do with it, but it was their very socialist narrative. And we shouldn't forget about that. We shouldn't forget our roots, because if we forget them in England, then we've also got a problem. And the core constituencies where you had not many public sector workers, largely white population, and no university. These are the kind of places which have always been our Labour seats, and these are the ones which we're in danger of losing. And the reason why we're in danger of losing them is twofold. It is on the one hand the current Labour narrative that goes out, which is sort of very North Islington based, which, you know, I'm sorry, once you get north of the M25, that is not what they want to hear from their Labour Party. And the second one is that we have allowed Labour leaders in particular to be demonised. The kind of language which comes out, which sort of just said they're all old, they didn't know any better because they weren't terribly bright, and they're all racist. All our polling which is showing is that what they were worried about was the pressure on the public sector. It was the pressure to plan for what you needed to provide. It was the starvation of money which allowed them to provide for everyone. People, in my experience, are by far more reasonable than they're given credit for. And the other thing which is really being underestimated is the real anger that's out there. Yesterday I had a meeting and I went down Regent Road, and usually when people when people talk to you and they're not sure, they sort of check that you're the person they think you are. But this guy just came up to me and went, "You have no idea how lonely I feel." And I was going, "Really?" And he said, "If you're a Brexiteer in Mayfair, you really feel as if you're the only one. But I work in Wales most of my time, and whenever I go back to Wales, you know." And I said, "Don't worry, there were 17.4 million of us. They may have fallen silent. And the challenge for us is not just to implement the outcome of this referendum, but just remember why the Labour voters voted. They didn't want to be left behind." One stat, 1/3 of the population in England still lives and works in the place they were born in. So this notion of that it's all about London, no, forget about it. And I don't want the Labour Party in England to happen what happened to the Labour Party in Scotland. And if we don't remember our roots, it could very easily happen that the Labour in England becomes the Democrats of the United States. It becomes something which is kind of rights-based. It's based in our cities. Well, if I want that, I vote Lib Dem. And I don't want to do that either.
So thank you for that. We will now move on to our second speaker, Kate Hoey, who has been MP for Vauxhall since 1989. She's been Minister of Sport, and she has worked with a wide range of Brexit organisations and is one of the only Labour Brexit figures who has spoken on the issue probably before, during and after the referendum in almost every corner of the country. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Great to be here, and I just want to pay tribute to Gisela, because I think she's done a wonderful job over the last month or so, because we have to get this fight back. And you know, she's absolutely right. After the referendum, we all took our eyes off the ball. We all thought we believed in democracy, people had voted, the government was accepting it, the party, even Theresa May, when she came out with her first action, was about we are going to deliver Brexit. And so we all went back and did things in a different way. And of course, unknown to us at the time, but the money was coming in, particularly from foreign donors. The Remain campaign was carrying on, and we are now in a situation where we have been very much on the back foot for a few months. But I think that is changing, and we have to show now that we want to actually make sure that our voters and Labour supporters and the Labour Party is forced to stick to what it said in its manifesto just a year after the referendum. Because that manifesto was very clear. We were going to honour the referendum, we were going to leave the single market. The customs union was a bit fudged, but I think most people read it that we were leaving the customs union. Now, it was disappointing too, and I think where we made a huge mistake is that, because I do think we are leaving, we will leave. The issue now is how we leave and whether we leave in a way that is actually going to maximise the opportunities that could come from being an independent, free trading country. But what we have lost is that whole period of time when we could have been, as a Labour movement, talking about the kind of country we wanted to be when we had that freedom and that independence. And we have wasted years. We wasted all that time. We've wasted two conferences, particularly the last conference, where most of the time was all about whether we needed a people's vote and not any discussion about the kind of problems. And there will be problems when we leave, but more importantly, the opportunities that it would give us. I'm becoming a bit of a fan of the Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninists. They seem to produce brilliant leaflets. There's one outside which I've seen before, which is really excellent. But also they produced something this week, which you see we haven't done within the Labour movement, although some of the unions have done some work on it. The EU barrier to control our railways, a really excellent, well-researched piece of work, which shows just how difficult it would have been if we stayed in the EU to do all those things that are in our manifesto about nationalising the railways and taking back control of our Royal Mail and all of those kinds of things. And we haven't done any work on that. We're wasting time. So I think that is a message that we have to get across. The other thing that I would say is I have been doing more recently with Leave Means Leave rallies around the country, and it shows exactly what Gisela has said. People's attitude and views have not changed. We are bringing in thousands of people at rallies where they are people who are absolutely steadfast about how they voted originally, get very, very angry indeed, the idea that they only did it because they were racist. That particularly is a real piece of bit of anger up in the northeast. And we've been in Bolton, we've been in Gateshead, we've been in Harrogate, we've been in Birmingham, down in Torquay, in Bournemouth, and all of those people there were just saying they could not accept that the parties, particularly Labour, seemed to be reneging on everything that had been promised. So I'm confident that we've still got the support out there, but what we have to do within the Labour Party, you know, we are a bit lonely in Parliament. There's about 4 of us really, and they keep leading the Labour Party for one thing or another. So there's a sort of a very small group of us who are prepared to stick with the manifesto. There are a lot of other Labour MPs, particularly from the north and the northeast and the Midlands, who, if you actually scratch their surface a little bit more, will discover that they have quite a lot of sympathy with the kind of things we're saying. And it just needs that little bit of push to get them to come out and be much clearer about their views, and I think that could happen. I think we have to remember that within the PLP, it's not that long ago that there were only 42 of us who didn't vote to have a no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. And many of those people who voted to get rid of Jeremy not long after he'd been actually elected leader are very, very upset that they didn't get rid of Jeremy, because they had all sorts of plans about becoming leader or taking over the party, and they haven't got an awful lot to do now because they know that they're not going to get rid of Jeremy this side of an election, and they have turned their focus onto Brexit, partly because some of them probably do genuinely believe that, and you know, we have to respect their views, that they think we'd be better to stay in, but also because they've seen it as a way of getting at Jeremy, because we know that Jeremy's position has been solidly critical of the EU for many, many years, and they have seen this as a way of chipping away at Jeremy's, particularly his own sort of morale on this, and I think that's why, you know, as far as possible, I certainly will be giving my support to the leader, because I think he is within Labour our only chance of actually holding on to a position where we do stick to our manifesto. And he has managed, I think quite cleverly, to, given that his one aim would be to keep the party united, he has managed to keep the position on the EU better than it could have been if it had been left to those who are actually in control of the PLP in terms of numbers. I also want to just stress the argument that all young people are in favour of staying in the EU. Particularly in Gateshead, we had a huge turnout there, and a very, very substantial number of young people were there. And afterwards we talked to a lot of them. And it was actually quite worrying, I think, for democracy. Some of the things they were relating about what was happening to them in their own institutions, some of them at university, some of them just in colleges, and some of them indeed still at school. And I met a very nice woman who came up to me with her, I think the girl was about 15, and she said to me, this is my daughter, and she said she had told her teacher that morning in school that she was coming to the rally, and the teacher had taken her to the head teacher, and the head teacher had tried to say, you can't come to this, you can't go to this, you know. And there is this real insidious kind of attempt by those in power, really, and in that kind of establishment to stop people even having the discussions and the ideas. And yet I know that so many of our young people do understand, and they have been almost kind of brainwashed about the fact that they might not be able to travel, that they might not be able to go abroad. And I always remind them, you know, that when I was, long before the common market came in, I hitchhiked all around Europe and nobody stopped me, and yet we weren't in any kind of common market. And also, you know, what does the rest of the world do? You know, this idea that somehow if you're not in the EU, life must be so dreadful outside, and yet the rest of the world manages quite well. So I think we just have to keep the faith. We have to keep within the PLP and within Parliament. Who knows what's going to happen in terms of votes? I mean, I got very criticised, but then I get criticised a lot in London because, as Gisela said, London's like being in a different planet. It's all right, so nice to go out and do rallies around the rest of the country. But you know, I got criticised because that vote, the five of us voted to stop us staying in the customs union, was then painted as being a vote for the Tory government, to keep the Tory government in power. What we were doing was keeping us out of the customs union. And so there will be other votes like that over the next month or two. The customs vote will come back from the Lords. We'll have that vote again. I don't see any, I really don't see that we will have any attempt to get people's vote through Parliament. It just would not happen. I mean, it is a second referendum, and I think Parliament, all those people who voted by a big majority that they would accept the vote, I think would find it extremely difficult to vote for people's vote, and I don't think the leadership of our party would allow that to happen. So who knows what's going to happen in the next month or two in terms of the actual negotiations. My position is very clear that we need to get out. I want to get out in a way that is going to allow the country, our country, the best possible opportunity to make the best economic sense of what happens in the future. We as a little group will work together as much as possible to try and stick to, you know, as far as possible to our beliefs, but more importantly to what the manifesto said. And we just need everyone in their local parties to speak out. It's difficult. I've heard about some London constituencies, apart from mine, where people who speak up at the back and say something that's vaguely anti-EU get literally shouted down. You know, that is a disgrace, and it's a disgrace for our party to be in that position. So we just have to keep courageous and remember, as Gisela said, when people say to me as well, you know, aren't you lonely in there? No, we're not lonely, because we've got 17.4 million people who voted with us, and we have to stick and keep our faith with them. Thank you.
Right, so now we will hear from our final speaker, who is, I think we can all agree, the business voice of the Labour movement, John Mills. He is the founder and chairman of JML, and the co-founder of Labour Leave, and also the former chair of Vote Leave. So we'll now hear from the business voice.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I'd like to just pick up this theme that's been running through what's been said so far about the relationship between Labour and what's happening with the Brexit discussions as they've evolved. And let's start with the 2015 election. we did a poll on the same day that the election took place to see how much difference it made that there was no commitment in the Labour manifesto for that election to having a referendum on membership. And what we found was that it made a difference of about 8 seats, and one of those was Ed Balls' seat. But also those 8 seats, if there'd been 8 fewer Conservative MPs and 8 more Labour MPs, there wouldn't have been a Conservative government in 2015, and there wouldn't then have been a referendum. So that was a very, very crucial mistake that was made by the Labour Party at that stage from their perspective. If you move on then to the referendum, I think it's worth just remembering that 37.5% on the polls that were produced by Lord Ashcroft of the people who voted in that election voted Leave, compared with the electorate in the 2015 election. So of those Labour voters, about nearly 40% voted for Leave. But if you include also the people who by this stage defected to the UKIP and other parties, probably nearly 50% of traditional Labour voters were in the Leave camp. If you then move on to what happened in the referendum of the election that was held in 2017, what happened there was that the Labour vote went up from 29% to 40%, but this only produced a net increase of 4 Labour seats. And the reason for this was that there were huge majorities in London and in places which hadn't voted Labour before, like Canterbury. But if you look at the rest of the country, there was a much more dire scenario to see, which was that of the Labour seats that were won then, 130 of them had swings against Labour recorded when those elections took place. So really the lesson to be learned from all this is that what you hear in London and the scene that is portrayed in Westminster, the fact that something like 80% of the MPs in Parliament, maybe more, maybe 90% are Remain, that there's a large majority of Remain people turning up at the Labour Party conference, simply doesn't reflect the reality on the ground of what is happening among Labour voters who traditionally have supported the party. So there are great dangers, I think, in where we are now, in what's going to happen to the Labour Party in the future. Now, if you look at what's then happened since the referendum, there was the election in 2017, which elected a parliament which unfortunately simply wasn't going to be willing to follow through with the logical outcome of the election. The outcome of the referendum was that we moved to something like the Canadian type of deal, which has been on the cards right the way through. But that depended, to get that through, depended on there being a majority in Parliament who were prepared to walk away if the alternative was a really poor deal. And once that majority in favour of walking away from a bad deal had disappeared, which is what happened in 2017, this then tipped us into the position that we've been ever since then. By and large, the Labour League position has been that we're better off supporting the sort of vision that the Prime Minister produced in her Lancaster House speech, and I think it was January 2017, where she was saying that basically what we were going to do is to come out of the single market, come out of the customs union, and negotiate a free trade deal with the European Union, broadly speaking on the same sort of lines as Canada. We would strongly have supported that. But once that became off the cards, then we've just drifted into this whole situation around Chequers, which I think is in real danger of landing the Labour Party in another trap. And that is that there will be so much fear of not having any kind of deal at all, and we will find Labour supporting, or at least enough Labour MPs supporting the government on a really poor Chequers deal to get this through. The arithmetic looks something like this, that you've got somewhere between 40 and 80, probably nearer 40 Conservative MPs in the European Research Group who would vote against the deal, but probably something maybe of that sort of number of Labour MPs who would support the government. But the danger for the Labour Party then is that they will be portrayed as being the people who supported the government in a very, very poor deal. And although I'm sure this will go down relatively well in the London area, the impact that this is going to have on our support throughout the country is really going to be very problematical. I think it's just worth remembering that Labour is not going to win the next general election by piling up huge majorities in London and Canterbury. It's going to win the next election by winning marginal seats in places like Wales and the Midlands and the North. And if we carry on the way we are, we're not going to do that. So our message really to the Labour Party is to be very, very careful about supporting a really poor deal. You're better even at this late stage to see whether we can shift to something that's going to be more viable, that's going to pull the country more together rather than drive it apart, or something along the Canadian lines. And whether this is going to happen, I think, remains to be seen. But if the vote from the government's proposal does get voted down when it comes to Parliament, probably this side of Christmas, there may still be options there that will be worth considering. And if so, we ask the Labour Party to support us in pushing for that direction of travel to provide some sort of reasonable solution to the Brexit negotiations we're now in.
Right, we will now move on to questions. We will start with any questions we might have from press, journalists. If you could identify yourself and what organisation you're from, and if you want to direct it at any specific panellist, I would be grateful if you identify. Gentleman over here.
Hello, Ben Glaze from the Daily Mirror. Question mainly to Kate, but all three of you might be able to answer. You touched, Kate, on where Jeremy Corbyn's at in this. Where do you think he is on all this? Does he deep down support Brexit? I mean, we know that he was anti-EU the vast majority of his time on the backbenches and then had his Damascene conversion upon becoming leader. Do you think he's secretly happy that we're leaving?
Well, I'm not privy to Jeremy's inner thoughts at the moment at all, but all I can say is, and there are other people here who would be able to concur with that every single lobby over, I came in 1989, he came in 1987, I think every single lobby that was in any way related to the EU, which was critical of the EU or against all the treaties, Maastricht, all of them, where we did get a vote, he was in the same lobby as myself and those other EU skeptics. So I think when he became leader, he was in a slightly more difficult position, particularly as the party had decided that they were in favour of Remain. But if I was to conjecture, which we can only do unless you're talking to him personally, I would be very confident that he wants to leave the EU, and that he probably and John McDonnell see the opportunities that it gives to actually have a genuinely socialist Labour government by leaving the EU and leaving it properly.
Anyone else like to comment on that one?
Can I just say, I think one of the dangers for the Labour Party and is that I know that what they would like is a general election, you know, and I can see those instincts as why they would like to force a general election. But I think if we conflate this with the negotiations on the European Union and how we're leaving, then we may end up with compromises which might deliver you a general election, but you end up with where you don't want to be. I think this should be really done step at a time. The decision to implement our decision to leave the European Union is one where I think you need to act in a national interest. And the party, don't worry, the party politics will come back soon enough. But this is not about either not propping up a government or trying to force a general election. The two should be seen as separate issues.
John, anything to add?
Yes, I must say I do agree with that. I think there's a real danger that Labour's going to be looking as if it's going to be acting in a sort of tactical way rather than really paying attention to where the real national interests lie, and that this is going to finish up by Labour paying a very heavy penalty by a lot of Leave voters in very important constituencies. I think there are real dangers here.
Next question, gentleman here.
Ian Wilson from BBC. Ask a couple of questions actually. Firstly to John, you mentioned that perhaps as many as 40 Labour MPs would be scared of a no-deal scenario and back the government. I just wanted to find out what's your basis for that number, especially tied to the point that Gisela made, which is actually, if Labour MPs are told this is a way to get rid of a Conservative government that you don't like, there'll be huge pressure on them, won't there, to vote against any deal in order to try to get to that type of outcome. And to Kate, could I just ask what, again, on Jeremy Corbyn, you're confident that he would not allow a so-called people's vote. I just wanted to assess what level of confidence you had that was actually possible to avoid this, that he would hold the line as Labour leader, because he would be under huge pressure to do so if a deal is voted down, and subsequently, of course, if a general election doesn't happen.
Start with John.
Well, I mean, this figure of 40 is just a guess, and I think the trouble is the numbers are shifting around all the time. I think there will be a lot of pressure on Labour members to vote for a deal, even if it's a very poor deal, and how many of them will do so and how many will stand against it. I think it's absolutely impossible to guess. I mean, the figure of 40 is simply just a sort of balancing figure against the Economic Research Group numbers, which I think are rather more firm. You know, I think that there's a pretty clear indication that something of that order that number will be voting against it. And it's, I think, then a real question about whether there's a similar number of bear in mind how tight the votes are in the House of Commons, whether there's a similar number of people in the Labour Party who are prepared to vote the other way. I think it's very hard to call, to be honest with you. I think there's a fair chance that what will happen is the Chequers deal or some variation of it that comes to Parliament to get voted down. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be the end of the day. I think if this does happen, then maybe there'll be some alternative which comes back to Parliament a bit later on, and maybe the voting numbers will be different. But I think that the real issue around here is that the numbers are too close to call, and it's very difficult to predict what is going to happen.
Just on that one, I mean, let's not forget we've still got a fixed term Parliament, and even if anything's voted down, it's not going to bring the government down the next day. There's going to have to be then a vote of no confidence, which obviously would put people back into their party situations again, and then you know, I don't see many Conservative MPs even at the moment voting for a general election. It's very different last time. I mean, everyone was supporting it, but I just don't think that there's going to be that. You know, I don't think we can guarantee that just because you defeat the government on a deal, or that you vote for, you know, whatever way the whipping is, whatever way the vote is, that there will be automatically a vote of no confidence in a general election. On the Jeremy thing, I mean, I suggest you take Jeremy out for lunch or something. He might tell you a bit more. I mean, you know, the people's vote is just so ridiculous. It really is a ridiculous suggestion that, you know, just over 2 years since we had a people's vote, which had a clear margin to leave, that we would have another one. And no one has defined, you know, what would be on the ballot paper. And of course they want a remain on it, which is a second referendum. And I would be very surprised and indeed very disappointed if our leader ever got himself into the position where he was actually whipping people to vote for a people's vote. I just don't think it will happen.
How many people, apart from there's 4 or 5, you know, of you have been, you know, obviously consistent, but how many of the people who perhaps voted to remain and leave constituencies?
There's quite a number of people who have, and we might see some evidence of that in the near future in terms of sort of public declaration, but there's quite a lot of MPs who would have had different views from ourselves on leaving, but who certainly do not want to go back to their constituents and have a people's vote. We know, I mean, I could say we're at least, without even thinking, of 20-25 Labour MPs who would never vote for a second referendum.
Gisela, would you like to add anything?
Well, I still have these suspicions as to the motives behind the People's Vote movement anyway. I was a bit slightly uneasy when I heard Vince Cable say the history of our electoral system means that starting new parties doesn't work, but you can fold movements into parties. And the Lib Dems may change their name, and we change the rules so the leader could be a non-MP. And I kind of get People's Votes, where I think this is a movement emerging that's trying to fold itself into an existing political party. On a more rational question of the people's vote, I'd say a very simple thing. All the conditions which have led to the referendum decision for us to leave, all the difficulties we've encountered in the last 2 years to actually make that happen. Tell me, which of these problems would be resolved by having another vote on it? Actually, none of them have been resolved. The uncertainty will be, if what business is worried about is an uncertainty, you actually extend the uncertainty. And as I said at the beginning, I have no evidence out there that people's opinions have shifted. So I think you just need, those who argue for people's vote just ought to be very careful what they're wishing for, because I think the most likely result is an entrenching and deepening of the existing lines. And if we kind of think that our political discourse ought to get yourself to a space where we're just a little bit more thoughtful in the words we use and people aren't quite as angry for good reasons, then I think the sooner we get a deal done, the better.
I think it's worth just reflecting a little bit also on just what all the difficulties on having a people's vote what might be. I must have suddenly described the people on the march as being a sort of Waitrose queue, and I think that's probably a fairly accurate description of them. But I mean, the difficulties are, first of all, that we're all set to leave at the end of March. It's extremely unlikely you'd be able to run a people's vote before then, in fact really impossible because of the time taken to get it organised, in which case the vote would not be whether we stay in the European Union but whether we rejoin. And if we rejoin, then we're into all sorts of different territory from where we are at the moment. What's going to happen to the rebate, what's going to happen to our Schengen agreements, what's going to happen to a whole range of other issues which joining the euro, for example, would all then come into play. So the scenario would be very different from what it would be if it was held or would be run right from the beginning, from where we started off. There are also other difficulties about it too, as Gisela has suggested. So I think the chances of the situation being resolved in any way by having another people's vote is very limited. And even if you did, I'm not at all sure that the result would be any different from what it was in 2016, particularly because of the more difficult choices that would have to be made about rejoining the euro and the European Union. So I think the chances of getting the situation resolved by a people's vote is very limited. And I must say, I think Labour nailing its colours to the mast on that particular issue is again something that is going to go down extremely badly, with Leave Labour voters all over the country, and the risks involved in doing so therefore are very high. So I would strongly recommend that Labour leaders certainly strongly campaigned against having the Labour Party committing itself to another people's vote.
Any other questions from the press? Yes,
yeah, Hugo Joe from The Sun. John, you made your view clear on whether or not Labour MPs should back Theresa May's deal when it gets to the Commons, that you think it would not be the best thing. But Gisela and Kate, I'd be interested to hear your view. Should Labour MPs back the PM's deal on the grounds that that's the best way to sort of nail down Brexit, or should they vote against in the hope of getting something better?
Well, we don't even know what the deal is. I mean, to me, the key thing which I would be looking for is whether the backstop becomes a never ever lobster pot. And I think that sort of there are one or two things which every person will look at of saying what is the real problem. And I think I've absolutely no reason to doubt that Northern Ireland, Kate knows much more about that than I do, that you can resolve it if you wanted to. The fact that the Taoiseach and the Commission says if there's no deal we won't put up a hard border, I'm sort of slightly puzzled why, if you can deal with it without a hard border if there's no deal, why can't you deal with it without a hard border if there's a deal? But maybe I'm missing something.
No, I don't think you are. I mean, I will wait to see the details. And one of the things, I think it'd be very interesting to see if we're allowed to mention a Tory MP. I mean, obviously Liam Fox I believe, is not going to vote for anything that genuinely doesn't allow free trade trade deals to be made. So I think that is a crucial part of what comes back. It's interesting, we haven't heard the word checkers very much, so I'm sure there is things going on. But on the Northern Ireland issue, I mean, it is just outrageous the way it's been blown up into, perhaps the wrong word, been turned into this big shibboleth that we've got to crack. It's just so ridiculous. Anyone, and what annoys me so much, and I say this all the time, is people who've never been to the border, never been to Northern Ireland, who took no interest in Parliament over years and years and years. Northern Ireland Questions had 10 people and a dog sitting there, and yet they're now great experts on Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, and it's ridiculous. There are cameras there already. There's a toll gate where everything has to stop if the car hasn't paid off the toll amount. And the Prime Minister was so stupid, and I will use that word quite right, thinking about it, she was stupid to talk about no cameras. There are cameras everywhere in our lives, and the idea that we can't use modern technology in the way to make it work. And let's not forget that the previous Taoiseach before Varadkar had allowed his civil servants to meet with our civil servants to talk about some of these issues, because they could see that there were some things that would have to be ironed out. And as soon as Varadkar came in, he stopped that. He stopped the discussions going on, and it has been played up by the EU and by the Irish government, I'm afraid, in a way that is designed because they are very, very unhappy that we're leaving. The Republic of Ireland it is going to affect them if there's a no deal more than anything else, but the border should not be allowed to be the thing that stops a good deal. And I know there's a couple of people here I see who are from Northern Ireland, and I'm sure they would agree with me on that it's just not an issue. It's been made an issue.
We can just add that what I find so interesting is that during the referendum, the border which David Cameron thought he could use as being the great bargaining chip was Gibraltar. And he went to Gibraltar, and the negotiations between Madrid and London, we know we was good as reach a deal. It's off the radar. So people of goodwill who have political determination to find a solution actually have a habit of finding one, and I think on this one we can.
Anything you'd like to add, John?
Well, only to say that I think that the Northern Ireland border has turned into a real trap for us. And what happened was that in December last year we were desperate to try and get trade negotiations underway, and as a result of this we agreed to a formulation of works for kicking the Northern Ireland problem down the road to get the trade negotiations going. But this has now turned out to be a real trap for us, because the way things are now going, the EU has the sort of say-so as to whether the commitments that we gave in December have been accepted or not. And this therefore puts us in a very weak bargaining position on agreeing a comprehensive deal, which I think has bedeviled the negotiations for the whole of the last, whatever it is, 9 months. I'm sure Gisela's right in saying that there would be no great problem about resolving the border problem if there was goodwill on both sides and real determination to do so. But the problem is that, having given the commitments we had, this has given such a bargaining counter to the EU that they will be, I think, reluctant to give it up unless we have substantial concessions on our side. So I think that unfortunately the arrangement that was made in December last year has turned out to come back and bite us very substantially.
Take a question from the lady over here.
Hi, my name is Silvia Massa. I'm a correspondent of the Spanish national newspaper, La Razón. I would like to ask you, or three of you, 2 questions. Do you think there is any chance to extend Article 50, or this is just a strategy from this May, and all this panic with the clock ticking is just something to pressure the Westminster to back the deal? And in that sense, you think that the scenario could be completely different if the vote is before Christmas or late in January, February, for example?
Article 50 would need legislation to go through Parliament. It would take quite some time to so far it hasn't been being raised very much, and I understand that certainly all the official government spokesmen saying that it's not even on the planning thing that might happen. So I don't think it'll happen. Of course it has to be agreed by all the EU countries, and I imagine they would probably, I mean, it might be that they're beginning to get to the stage too of thinking, look, we've had enough of this. Do we really want to extend this? Even though they would still like us to have another referendum and stay in. But I don't see that as being, I don't see it happening, but maybe these are differently.
Well, no, I mean, you have to cast your mind back and recall that there was a logic to triggering Article 50 when it was triggered. It gave you a 2-year period and it would come to a conclusion before the next European Parliament elections. You want to arrive at the major political negotiations with this Commission, with this European Parliament, and within this financial framework. So then you can argue about implementation, as long as implementation is only to put into practice what you have agreed, but not and never ending negotiations. I know there was a very interesting interview not long ago with the former Commission President Barroso, who was actually by far more positive about what kind of deal could be delivered. And then he asked, and then he sort of reminded people that there's a proud European tradition called stopping the clock. So you don't suspend it, you just stop the clock. To which, again, I say, look, if you just want to stop the clock for 36 hours, that's fine, you know. And we have that. But otherwise, extending this, it's a bit like the second people's vote. What do you think, which we haven't been able to achieve in the last 2 years, has changed, which you now think will be achieved by just giving it more time? And the answer is nothing. And given the way every European Union negotiations I've ever been involved in literally goes up to the wire, I think it's now for people to focus, deliver within that time frame, and don't think that delaying would resolve anything.
Yeah, just a couple of points on this. I mean, first of all, I think there is still an issue that's unresolved. I think it's actually going before the courts before very long as to whether the UK can unilaterally extend the Article 50 period, or whether you have to get agreement of all the various states in Europe and the European Parliament. Especially if that is the case, then this is going to drag on forever, because the European Parliament's elections are next May, and that means it's probably going to be a month before the elections where electioneering is taking place, and then there's going to be a whole lot of discussions about who has what role in the newly elected Parliament, which will probably take us through to June or July, and then you run into the holidays. So I mean, extending the Article 50 period for all the reasons that have been already given is really, I think, probably impractical. I don't think there's going to be any majority in Parliament for doing it. On the question of timing, it's absolutely right that the European Union has got a long tradition of doing everything at 5 to 12 or well afterwards if you stop the clock. One of the problems is that unless something is decided by about Christmas, there simply isn't going to be time to implement whatever the decision is before we get to the end of March. So really the idea that what we can do is to slide all the final negotiations through beyond the end of this year to February and then March, and agree something on the 25th of March, which is going to be implemented on the 29th, is just completely impractical. And I think this is going to cause some difficulties, because if you have got a deadline, this does actually focus everybody on making sure that you do get a deal done, if there is one to be accomplished. But if you've still got 3 months to go, but it's got to be done by Christmas, I think this may cause difficulties, because people will want to see the negotiations sliding into the new year, even though this actually turns out to be impractical in terms of implementation. So I think there is actually quite a tricky problem about timing there.
Any other questions from the press before I open it to the floor generally? No? Okay, so now I'll take questions from anyone and everyone. And we would like to limit comments just...
No, comments as well.
Comments, oh, you want comments as well? Okay, well, comments as well then, whatever you want to say. Start with Calvin Hopkins, MP.
Yes, really it's a question. I'll put it forward a question to John in particular. Are there lessons to be learned from continental socialist parties who seem to be in desperate decline because they've taken a centrist pro-EU position, The French socialist parties almost disappeared. The Greek socialist parties did disappear. The economy was being brutalised by the EU, and the Greek socialist party supported the EU. I mean, they're now history. Syriza initially started off as a left Eurosceptic party, slid away towards acquiescing in the EU. But France is the best example, where in the recent presidential election, the first round, out of the blue, Mélenchon, a left-wing Eurosceptic, got nearly 20% of the vote. The French Socialist Party got 7.5% in the first round. This could happen to all sorts of parties on the left, unless they understand that the European Union is essentially anti-democratic and certainly anti-democratic socialist organisation.
Well, I think it's a general problem of not only the democratic left, but the democratic right. Having been in charge for a long period of time, but being very ineffective at getting the economy to grow, to allowing regional and intergenerational disparities all to get bigger and bigger, to let the rich get richer, while most people don't have wage increases. And it just seems to me that this is a perfect formula for encouraging populist and xenophobic parties to come to the fore. And of course, this is exactly what's happened. I mean, I think the European Union has played some role in all this. I don't think by any means it's the only factor that's been there, but I think that one of the reasons why people voted for Brexit was because they regarded the European Union as being all part of this sort of process of agglomeration of power in the centre, at the expense of the periphery, and very low rates of economic growth, the sort of treatment that was meted out to Greece and to some extent Italy and Spain as well, all added to the general climate of distaste of what was going on. And I very much hope that there will be changes away from all this, but at the moment it doesn't look terribly like that's going to happen.
I'm not going
Because see, the European Union was founded on the notion that ideology is dangerous. Nationalism has a very dark side, and therefore, if you become bureaucratic and actually not terribly inspiring, but provided you deliver a better tomorrow, economically better tomorrow, then people are prepared to make that trade-off. That deal is falling apart all over the place. I mean, the most interesting things were the two German Länder elections. In Bavaria, population of 11 million, so twice the size of Scotland. Ever since I've been a child, it always was a question of how much the CSU will win by. It never was a question of whether anybody else will win. Last election, the second biggest party were the Greens. Hesse, the same. The two main losers at the weekend were the major political parties. So what you've got is this fragile creature called democracy, which we take for granted, actually is being really threatened everywhere. Italy, north of Rome, it's all 5-star. You know, even Macron, that was a movement that you folded over a structure. So if these things are happening everywhere, then I think that if we don't remain true to implementing a referendum result, I think what will happen is that a whole lot of people just simply will not vote again. You know, they just sort of say, what's the point of going to vote? And then you are in danger. And to me, one of the really good things which have come out of the referendum result is that when Parliament comes to debating the immigration bill, it will be the front benches of two major parties who will decide on what our immigration policy would be. And we will not be at the hands of some small, pressure groups, extremist groups. We've managed to contain the extremes. And I think in terms of the socialist parties, it grieves me no end. I mean, in 97 when we were elected, the Socialist Party, the majority of European governments were socialist parties, and where have they gone? But I think our decline happened simply earlier than the others. That fragmentation of the main political parties is happening everywhere, and we must make sure it doesn't happen to us.
We will now take questions in groups of 3, so who would like to, over there, if you could identify yourself first.
Yeah, Ed Rennie from Left of Centre Brexit. Isn't the strongest case against people's vote in a second referendum the fact that arguing against another Scottish referendum would therefore become completely impossible, and therefore would it be catatonically stupid of any Labour MP to be campaigning for a second referendum on the EU, given that they wouldn't be able to argue against another one happening in Scotland. And the Labour Party doesn't want to lose Scotland even more than we have already.
Second question.
Thank you. Paul Embry, I'm a trade unionist and a pro-Brexit campaigner. It's always struck me one of the mysteries of modern politics in Britain is the way that the Labour Party has gone from being or having a very strong anti-EU, prior to that anti-EEC trend within it, to now, certainly in terms of the PLP, being almost exclusively in favour of the EU, with obviously some good exceptions. And I just wonder what the panel's assessment of why that happened, because I mean you only have to go back, in 1983 for example, the manifesto itself contained a commitment to withdraw from the EEC. You only have to look at some of the real heavyweights on the Labour benches who were fiercely opposed to the EU, people like Tony Benn and Peter Shaw and Barbara Castle and Michael Foot. And you know, in terms of the wider movement, more recently people like Bob Crow, etc. And you know, I guess the question is why did that turn around? And it's a seismic shift. What's the panel's assessment of why that happened and why Labour has become infatuated with the European Union?
Take one more question and then we'll have answers. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it's just a brief point. My name's Joe McVie. I'm an ex-firefighter. Before that I was a coal miner for my sins, and I'm from a little village called Same in the northeast of England. It was actually built on coal. We had 3 coal mines, Lord Londonderry one of them, and us. And after 1947, we became nationalised. Same mistake in Labour history. We had the former leader of the Labour Party, which won the safest seats in the whole of the UK, or Great Britain at the time. And unfortunately it was Ramsay MacDonald, but that's another story. Anyway, the issue is this: I go back to the North East 3 or 4 times a year. I sit in the pubs and clubs with my old comrades, we have a chat and all that. I haven't met anybody who voted to remain. Anybody. That town has received hundreds of millions of pounds in subsidies from the EU, allegedly, to help to support the infrastructure and all the rest of it. And yet, they still voted in their droves to leave the EU. The position I find myself in when I speak to them, I said, so what about a second vote? The answer is bollocks, we don't want a second vote. We talked about, what about a second referendum? So we don't want a second referendum. The position is quite clear, they want to leave, I said, what about a deal? They said, we don't give a stuff about a deal. We want to leave, we want to leave now. So we could leave last year, we were left last year. The day after the 23rd of June would have been, it's 2016, they would have been quite happy leaving. They've got this. One thing that really concerns me, and perhaps the panel can enlighten this, is that I'm from a generation where my dad voted Labour, my grandfather voted Labour, his father voted Labour. I've now got a situation, I'm in my late 50s, I've got people in the 30s, 20s, 30s and 40s, not interested in politics, not interested in coming to CLP, not interested in talking about what I call something that would interest me, bores the shit out of them. The position is quite clear. We have got a real problem trying to motivate younger people outside of this Remain momentum people. That's fine, that's great, I mean, please are interested. I've got a real issue because when I go back to the North East, the biggest demonstration these kids are going on are going to defend women who've been sexually assaulted in Sunderland by, immigrants, for want of a better description. And what happens is, hundreds turn out for these marches through Sunderland. These people should be natural Labour voters, and they are not. They're going to go to UKIP or worse, and that's the real issue we've got. And I think the Labour Party, and there's some good MPs up there, some good comrades, and I support them wholeheartedly. And you're absolutely right, scratch the surface, I know exactly where they're going to stand. The situation is quite clear. We've got a real issue getting the young people who aren't in momentum, who aren't prepared to go out and knock on the door. We've got to really get those people interested in politics, and we need people, and it means the leadership of the Labour Party have got to go into these peak villages in South Wales, in South Yorkshire, Central Scotland, where they've lost hope. We've got to reinvigorate the Labour Party there. Your thoughts?
So should we start with Kate?
Oh, well, all very interesting questions. I mean, Ed, isn't it interesting that every single referendum up until now has been accepted, even though some of them got incredibly small margins, and yet the one where it was quite a reasonable margin is being threatened with, to be overturned. So I think that tells us something about whose interests it was to keep us in the EU. The Scottish referendum, it won't stop, obviously, the SNP always calling for a referendum, but it certainly puts Labour people in Scotland in a very ridiculous position if they support a second referendum on this and don't want one in Scotland. Paul, you know the history of the Thatcher government and the European Union being seen as the great way of keeping trade union rights and all of that kind of thing. And yet, ironically, our trade union rights and everything that we've got in terms of maternity benefits and so on, some of them better than actually in the EU, have all been really won by trade union struggle and people within the labour movement. So I do remember, because I was part of the Tony Blair Good Europeans. We were told very strongly when he came in, we've all got to be good Europeans now. We were all sent off to the EU to make sure that the rest of the Europe understood that we loved Europe and we were going to be part of all of that. And I was part of Jack Straw's Home Office team in the Europe when at that time it wasn't majority voting. So we were able to stop things. But that was part of the reason, although I'd always been very cynical about the EU, that turned me completely against it, because you saw how behind the scenes people behaved in terms of, we'll give you this if you give us that, and all that kind of horse trading that went on. But all the time, Tony Blair was pushing and pushing and pushing. I don't know whether he then thought maybe long term he was going to become a commissioner, or whether it just was his personal views, but certainly that whole Blair time changed the party and consolidated what had been a change made for maybe what was seen at the time good reasons in terms of what was happening with the Thatcher government. But with where we are, and it's not taken a long time to actually get to this position. We just have to live with it and try and hope that the new leadership of the party is going to gradually change things and recognise that we're much better off out. Oh, and Joe, I absolutely agree with you about those kind of areas and what's happened, and particularly people who voted for the first time. I was struck at all the rallies we did during the referendum, people who would come up and they'd never voted before, and they were just almost in tears. We can vote, and they thought their vote mattered, and we told them their vote mattered, and we told them, your vote can make a difference. I remember saying at rallies, just find one other person who isn't going to vote and get them out to vote. That really will make a difference. And I think if they now see that we particularly within the Labour movement betrayed them, I think that's very, 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 very dangerous for the Labour Party, but it's also dangerous for democracy.
Is there any further comments?
Just to add to this, actually, Kate, you've put why the party turned much better than I usually explain it by the Delors Commission, but it's all right. It's Blair, but it's Blair who entrenched it, which I kind of forgotten. And Joe, you're right about the youngsters. We got to give them, which also gives them a sense of the collective, quite frankly, because at the moment we're sort of moving into very selfish territory. But I just want to say about Scotland. The thing you've got to remember, and it's very easily forgotten, is that of the 1.6 million people who voted for Scottish independence, 400,000 of those voted to leave the European Union. And Nicola Sturgeon knows that. So she's been very clever in kind of making it look as if we, the SNP, who have got the overwhelming majority, and we are also, all our people are Remainers, but actually they're not. So she's aware of the underlying arithmetic underneath that. And but what is so dangerous for the Labour Party is that in 2017, the Scottish election, we got a few more Labour MPs, but that wasn't a resurgence of Labour. No. It was a reflection of three-way fights. And the 2017 election folded between nationalists and unionists. And the SNP has cornered the nationalist label and is to the left of a lot of what Labour is doing, not least courtesy of the Barnett formula, and enables them to be so. And the Tories have managed to be the unionist party of the United Kingdom. And be careful, watch what happened in Scotland, because it could happen here if Labour doesn't get its grip.
John?
Yes, on the Scottish referendum, I think Brenda of Bristol is much against referendums as general elections. And I think that, although I understand the argument you put forward, the economics of the Scottish independence have really fallen apart because of oil price changes and so forth. And the support for a referendum and the result that they want, the SNP wants, seems to be falling. So I don't think that's a terribly real threat. Going back to what Paul was saying, I think that the change partly came from the speech that Jacques Delors made to the Trade Union Congress in, I think, 1978 or 1988, I think it was, which led to the trade union movement rather than swinging around to support the EU rather than the reverse. I think part of the reason why so many Labour MPs are in favour is that just in the general move for the Labour Party to become more middle class, more London orientated, more internationalist, and I think this is reflected in the sort of people who become MPs nowadays. And I think that one of the things that is a big danger for the Labour Party is that if the Labour Party becomes too London orientated, too elitist, then it just loses touch with its traditional voters. And that's one of the real dividing lines that came out of the referendum, which I think we really, from the Labour Party point of view, want to take very seriously and do something about as much as we possibly can. And just finally, I just think it is worth reinforcing what Joe was saying, that the vote has remained, or people's opinions have remained remarkably steady, despite all the onslaught there's been from the press and the BBC and everywhere else about what a disaster Brexit is supposed to have been. That simply is not the view that most people in this country who voted Leave take. The shift in the polls has been remarkably small, and I think it's just worth remembering. I think the polls now, if you take the poll of polls, shows that the 52-48 is more or less reversed. But you may remember that was exactly what the polls said just before the referendum took place in 2016. So it's really too close to call. The opinion hasn't shifted, and what we need to do is to get on and make a success of what we decided then.
I think that was an excellent wrap-up comment, and if we have any other questions at the end, people feel free to ask the speakers when we're finished, but I think we should wrap up now and give our thanks to the three speakers for excellent comments.